Hey there folks, Raie here. A lot of you were requesting that I do a cert guide for the heavy assault class, so that's what we'll be looking at today. Things are going to flow a little bit differently than the last guide for a few different reasons. The first is that the starting weapons between each faction are very different. Unlike the light assault class, where a carbine is pretty much a carbine, the heavy assault starting weapons emphasize different playstyles more so than probably any other class in the game. The second is that I want to make this guide both useful for newer players and more experienced players. That said, we're going to break down what I feel are the most useful certs between each faction's early and late game builds. And just like the first cert guide, the point will be to make your heavy assault class as effective as it can be as quickly as possible. So let's talk about the important certs for the heavy assault class regardless of which faction you're playing. And when you hear me say early game and late game, I actually want to define early game as what I feel is essential to the class, whereas late game is after you've used the class for a while and you've become comfortable with it. So end game is basically going beyond what is required for the class to operate well. The absolute first thing you should probably put a cert point into is flak armor, and there is no stronger or more overpowered suit upgrade than flak armor, and it's kind of sad that this is the case, but the reason that it's so powerful is because there are just so many explosions in this game. I mean, you have to think, there's grenades, tank rounds, rocket pods, liberator zephyrs, even splash damage from your own rockets. So flak armor is the safe way to play the heavy assault class. Especially if you're playing a tank busting class, you definitely want that flak armor. The first rank will usually help keep you from dying to a claymore, but subsequent ranks are easy to pay off as well. I suggest at least going to rank 2 pretty early on. Flak is not the end-all be-all in my mind though. I know a lot of people who run nanoweave, which seems to be the second top choice, as it usually helps you survive another bullet. So you do need to make a decision. I mean, are you going to primarily be dealing with explosives, or are bullets going to be your main concern? Something most people will not suggest you get is the shield capacitor, but I happen to think that the shield capacitor is an extremely powerful suit option for the heavy assault class, especially if you're running a resist shield. Now, without upgrades, your shields will start refilling after 10 seconds, but with the shield capacitor at max rank, you can actually drop it down to 7.5 seconds. And that doesn't really sound like a lot, but that's a 25% faster recharge activation. So it depends on what threats you're going to face, what type of playstyle you emphasize. If you do decide to play with a shield capacitor, I advise at least waiting until rank 3 or 4 before you actually start using it. Otherwise, flak or nanoweave is just more powerful flat out. Somewhere down the line, probably after you get a scope for your weapon, you should pick up a medkit. For most situations, the medkit will help you out more than a resto kit will, and it gives you all of your health back instantly, whereas a resto kit restores health over 6 seconds. Just the first rank of this is good early on, but feel free to get the second or third rank later when you find yourself just wondering what you should be putting cert points into. The nanite mesh generator is the bread and butter of the heavy assault class, and it's easy to throw some points into it to make it a bit more effective. Grabbing the rank 3 pretty early on is a smart decision, and it's really inexpensive. But I also wouldn't do this until you've fully upgraded your starting weapon. Alternatives to the standard nanite mesh generator are either the adrenaline shield or the resist shield. The adrenaline shield restores some of its shield when you kill an enemy, and the resist shield doesn't absorb a specific set amount of damage, but it will instead reduce the damage you take by 45% while it's active. Both of these are very good, but they're also very expensive alternatives to the nanite mesh generator, and they have specific purposes and usefulness. I don't advise grabbing either of these until you become more comfortable with the class and really understand how to play as a heavy assault. The standard frag grenade is a solid choice all around, and I don't suggest messing with the concussion or the anti-vehicle grenades until you've gotten a firm grip on the class, and you're looking to specialize your loadouts a bit further. The rocket launchers for each faction are the same, but have different names. The standard DUMBFIRE rocket launcher is something you can hold on to for pretty much forever, but if you want a bit more versatility at the expense of damage, then purchase a launcher with an air lock-on potential. The faction-specific ones will allow you to lock onto an air target while still being able to dumbfire, And there's also a launcher that locks onto ground targets, but I don't really suggest buying it, as once you get decent with your aiming, you'll be able to nail people with your dumbfire launcher pretty easily, and actually before the enemy gets a chance to react. The Annihilator locks onto both air and ground targets, but it cannot dumbfire. This weapon is really only useful in groups as it doesn't deal as much damage as the other launchers, and generally I don't suggest it unless you're with a platoon who uses it as well. The Decimator is a common pool dumbfire launcher that deals more damage than the standard faction-based launchers, but has one less ammo and also supposedly has a slower projectile. So long story short, you can either keep the standard dumbfire launcher or pick up the faction-specific launcher that can dumbfire and lock onto air targets. That would be my suggestion. When the new faction-specific rocket launchers come out, they'll have more specific uses and they won't really be direct upgrades, so my advice in this guide will still be the same. They'll definitely be fun toys either way though. So those are the general suggestions for the heavy assault class regardless of which faction you play. Now let's take a look at the faction-specific loadouts. We'll start first with the TR because they probably have the most balanced weapon in terms of effectiveness at both close and longer distances. The T9 Carve is the TR Heavy Assault starting weapon, and it's a beast right out of the box. It has a 100-round magazine, which is tied with the NC starting gun, but has less cone of fire bloom and less vertical recoil, and actually deals better damage at range than the Vanu weaponry, while tying for the highest LMG firing rate in the game, which is 750 rounds per minute. To translate, the T9 Carve can destroy enemies at medium to long range, and it is still effective as a bullet hose in close quarters thanks to that quick firing rate. Because of the sheer versatility of this weapon, you can play it at practically any range and still be effective. The first upgrade you want for this, and pretty much any weapon, is a good scope. I like the infrared scope on the Carve the best, but if you want to kill people at longer distances, then go for the 3.4x or the 4x scope. Next thing we want to do is throw a forward grip on the weapon. The side-to-side recoil is probably the biggest detriment of this weapon, but a grip will greatly increase the Carve's accuracy at range. I opted for the silencer in the footage you see, and I really do like it. There's no real downside to running a silencer if you're using it at medium range, because the bullet drop really won't kick in unless you're playing at longer ranges. But this comes down to playstyle, so if you're focused on fighting at range, I don't suggest a suppressor. But if you feel like purchasing a shiny new weapon instead, there are definitely some options that will tailor to your specific playstyle. If you're in extremely close quarters, pump shotguns are a very powerful option, but if you play with a bad frame rate, a pump action is pretty much a waste of time. If you're looking for a close quarters LMG, then the T32 Bull probably fits the bill, but for very long ranges, the TMG-50 is the most powerful and accurate long-range weapon the TR have access to. The new Conglomerate has access to what's widely accepted as the best sniping LMG in the game, and by that I mean it has the highest damage and decent accuracy at range. The NC6 Gauss Saw sports a 100-round magazine, but has an extremely low firing rate and the longest reload time of any LMG ever. Its poor hipfire accuracy coupled with slow firing rate means that this weapon is not built for close quarters combat. It's best used at range, looking down a scope. That said, the Gauss Saw has access to a 2x scope, which neither the TR or the VS starting weapons do, and it's a good in-between scope if you're looking for some versatility at range and up close, but it's generally held that a 3.4x or a 4x scope are the best options for the Gauss Saw. But that's only after you slap on some attachments to the thing. I'd suggest taking a 2x or an infrared scope to start out with, then once your gun is complete, I guess, come back and then grab a more powerful scope. Because the recoil both vertical and side to side is actually pretty bad without proper attachments. So right after you pick up a scope, you want to grab a compensator, and after the compensator, work on the forward grip and the advanced forward grip, which the Gauss Saw fortunately has access to. There is an option for high velocity ammo, but I'm not sure that I'd recommend using it. The Gauss Saw already has a pretty fast projectile, so the increased vertical recoil you'd get from the high velocity ammo probably isn't worth it. And at this point your gun is pretty much complete. You can try out the 3.4x or the 4x scope, or you can just keep the 2x or infrared you picked out from the start. If you're not digging the starting weapon, the NC have a lot of really interesting and powerful options, like the Anchor, which for one has a really cool name, or the EM1. both of which have a high rate of fire and they work in close quarter situations, or the EM6, which also has a high rate of fire but is meant for long range combat, similar to the Gauss Saw. For extremely close quarters, shotguns are always an option. And if you're curious about the jackhammer, I don't really recommend it. It's fun, yes, but it's less powerful than the other shotguns, and it's usually just going to get you killed. And lastly, we have the VS, which have access to the Orion LMG. The Orion has a 50-round magazine, which is the lowest of the three, but the same fast firing rate as the T9 Carve, a quick reload time, and a really decent hipfire. Not only that, you move at 75% of your normal speed while aiming down sights, opposed to the 50% with most other weapons. The Orion can dump on people right out of the box at short to medium ranges, and it feels more like a carbine than a real LMG. But that gives VS players the opportunity to deal with close quarter situations better than the other factions' starting weapons. So first thing, as always, grab a scope. I'm currently using infrared, but the 1x is another good alternative. I don't suggest the 3.4x or the 4x scopes because they don't really play to the strengths of the Orion. Secondly, you have the option of going for either a laser sight, which will bump up your hit fire a bit more, or a forward grip, or I guess the flashlight if you just want to give people something to shoot at. I like the forward grip because I'm usually aiming down sights anyway, even at close ranges, but if the hip fire is more your thing, then the laser sight is a good option as well. I'm not using the flash suppressor or the standard suppressor, but they both seem to be pretty viable options. They just don't make the weapon feel quite right to me, so there's no reason for me to get them. Usually you use at least a flash suppressor so your muzzle flash doesn't get in the way, especially at nighttime, but the muzzle flash from the Orion is really small, and it's so small that it should never get in your way. And this isn't the case with all weapons. The Polaris, for example, has a pretty big muzzle flash, and it doesn't actually have access to a flash suppressor, which is kind of interesting. And of course, if you don't want to use the standard LMG, then there are some options, though the Orion is probably your best bet in close quarters combat. You can either pull the Flare or the URSA, which are high damage, high velocity sniping LMGs. The SVA-88 is also a strange and very powerful LMG. It's built like a sniping LMG, but fires as fast as the Orion and also gives you that same aim down sights bonus of 75%. I didn't talk about SMGs at all, but they're definitely viable options for the heavy assault class as well, especially the high capacity SMGs. But those are my thoughts on the individual factions. Just to recap, here's a cert breakdown I'd recommend for a newer player. Your first cert should be into the suit upgrade, so FLAK or nanoweave armor, and then put another one into your NMG, get a scope for your weapon, then purchase the medkit, finish off your gun with all of the recommended attachments or just buy a new one, then put 2 or more ranks into your suit, then 2 more ranks into your NMG, and then build and experiment from there. I hope this short certification guide will help you folks save some time and maybe save you a bit of frustration as well. And if this little guide has been interesting or helpful, please feel free to like, subscribe, and tell your friends about the channel. And if you have any questions or helpful advice, just drop a comment below. Thanks very much, folks. Raie signing off.
The facility is secure. Excellent work.
Do you have spare batteries? I am in your debt. Acknowledged.